and I started recording. So yeah, so we will start with looking at the different fuels, and before we start, we'll just look again at the agenda. So today we are on the second day of the training, and we will be together for the next 2 hours. Before we start with the technical part, let's quickly look at some of the housekeeping rules. So this training will be all virtual, and if you have any urgent clarification, you can either raise your hand during the presentation and we'll stop and answer to you. Otherwise, you can use the question and answer box at any time during the presentation, and Nicola and I, we will reply to you. Also, if you have any other additional questions, do not hesitate to contact us by email. You can contact me, Arnaud, or the Africa Program mailbox. So on this first slide, if we look at the OECD region, we see that around 80% of the energy supply mix, it's made of fossil fuels. So you have coal, oil, and natural gas. But if we move to Africa, this share, it decreases and goes to around 50% only. And you see that the share of biofuels and waste, it's even bigger. So in Africa, it's around 50% for biofuels and waste. And if you look at nuclear, hydro, and solar, wind, etc., it's very minimal. Now, when we move to sub-Saharan Africa, we see that the share of biofuels is even bigger. It's around 70%. And if we look at Zambia now, it's even bigger and accounts for around 75%. So in Zambia, the importance of biofuels in the energy mix, it's very, very high. Now, let's quickly look at how data are collected and where they come from. I will go very quickly on this slide because yesterday we looked into detail at this, but there are many sources to collect data, and for supply and transformation data, you can get the information from surveys and administration data for energy industries, producers, imports, and exporters. For demand data, you can collect energy consumption from end-use surveys for households and companies. You can also use an integrated approach where you use existing surveys to add extra questions on energy consumption. You can also make use of direct measurement, for example, for electricity, and also use estimation and modeling in order to fill gaps in between surveys to have a more complete time series. Now, let us use again the software menti.com to do some interactive questions. Can you please connect to www.menti.com? And I will also connect myself. So yeah, so when you're on www.menti.com, please use the code that appears on the screen. So 38, 12, 20, and 38. So connect to www.menti.com and use the code 38, 12, 20, and 38. And the first question is, how imports of combustible fuels are taken into account in energy statistics? Do you think that we need to report it every time that a product enters a country, even if it is just for transit? We will consider it as imports. Do you think that it's only imports when we account only imports when it is by the country of final destination, or you think that it's import statistics based on future contracts of energy commodities? So we already have 9 participants who are replying, even more now. I'll just give you some more time. So the code is 38, 12, 20, and 38. We have 25 answers now. So indeed, most of you got it right. The answer is we take into account only imports by the country of final destination, and we don't take into account transit or future contracts. The second question is, what can we consider as refinery inputs? So what do we use in a refinery? Which fuel? Do you think that we can only use crude oil? Can we input crude oil and natural gas liquids? Or do you think that we can input crude oil, NGLs, but also other products from fossil and bio origins? Just give a few more seconds for people to think, what can we use as refinery inputs? So again, most of you got it right. So in a refinery, we can use as inputs crude oil, natural gas liquids, and other products of fossil origins. And so one last question before we get to the presentation. So what are natural gas liquids? So is it natural gas, liquefied natural gas, same as liquefied natural gas, but in a different form? Is it a waste product extracted during natural gas purification and of no value? Or is it a mix of gases different than natural gas and more similar to oil products? So what are natural gas liquids? We think here we see that it's 50-50. Most of you think that it's between same as LNG or a mix of gases. So the correct answer is it's a mix of gases different than natural gas and more similar to oil products. And at the IEA, we report NGLs together with the oil. So now let's move back to the presentation.
I think the sound is mute again, Zakia.
Are you saying that it's muted?
Yes, I don't. Well, I did not hear any voices, so I think it might be an issue there.
Okay. Let me check again. Mm. Now?
No, still no nothing.
Okay. Okay, I think it's with my
First of all, let's have a look. Discuss for this part. We will go.
Can you hear now?
Since it is coal is not used a lot on the African continent, and then we discuss renewables and electricity. So let's start by discussing some primary and secondary oil products energy statistics. So first of all, let's have a look at the crude oil production by countries. And this production is dominated by 10 major producers who represent more than 70% of the global demand. And among those 10, we have three key actors that represent a third of this demand. So an energy landscape in that situation that is far from equally reparted around the globe. Here we are talking about crude oil, but this is not the only part of these categories. We also discuss about refined oil products, secondary oil products. So if we have a look now at the world refinery intakes, we can see that although OECD demand OECD refinery intakes, stayed more or less stable in times, we have an important growth of refinery activities in several non-OECD regions, such as China, Asia, Middle East. This growth shows a growth in the oil demand in those countries, of the need for the population of specific oil products. And as we can see on the right, China and all of the other non-OECD regions grew in terms of oil demand in those countries. It is not that visible on this graph on the right, but Africa also knew in the last decade an important growth in its oil demand. So let's have a closer look. In these graphs, you can see pretty clearly that transport has been the sector that drove the most oil demand in Africa for the last 30 years. Road transportations has grew a lot in those last decades, and hence the demand for oil products. But it's not only that. We have also growth in aviation fuel due to increased air traffic, and also some marine fuel demand that grew due to the increased activity in several ports and port terminals in Africa. Do not forget that transport might be the biggest one, but we have all of those sectors that grew also in terms of demand, such as industries in a lesser way, residential, and non-energy use, which is still in a minor in Africa, while it represented a high share of demand now in OECD countries. So now that we discussed some key trends, let's have a look at how we classify our products, those products in our methodology. So we try to distinguish between the products that feed the refinery and the product that comes out of the refinery. So primary oil products, which are coming from natural resources, and finished secondary oil products, which are manufactured in the refinery. This is a rough definitions, of course, because we have some of the output of the refinery that will be used later on as input of refinery. So this will get a little bit more complex later on. Just remember that those products can be classified in many ways. Also for the finished secondary oil products, due to the fact that they are sold products, the name most of the time comes with a specific set of physical properties. Please, if you have doubts on how to report a specific product, do not hesitate to refer to the IRES, so the International Recommendation for Energy Statistics from the United Nations. This is the methodology that we are following at the IEA and that is followed by most of the international organizations. So to discuss it a bit more in detail, in primary oil products, you will find crude oil and natural gas liquids, for example, coming from oil wells or natural gas fields. But you can also find some synthetic crude oil, which we'll discuss a little bit later, and some secondary products as inputs to the refinery, additives and feedstocks, for example. On the other end of the refinery, we will see first of all, some gases, some refinery gases that are part of the process, and then all of the products that we can find on the market today, such as naphtha, gasoline, diesel, fuel oil, lubricants, bitumen, and in our statistics, we try to focus on the products that the quantity of those products that will be used for energy uses, of course. So now let's have a look at how we could represent the chain of flows for each product. So let's first the primary oil products. The refinery intake is mostly crude oil, but as I told you before, it can also include some other primary and unfinished secondary oil products. But let's keep it simple for now. We focus on the indigenous production of crude oil and some other sources for natural gas liquids, for example. One note here, we focus in our methodologies on marketable productions, onshore or offshore, but marketable production coming from within the border of a country. If it's coming from another country, it will be reported as trade, so imports or exports. Then we can have also some stocks, some crude oil that have been kept in waiting for the demand to be used in the refinery. And then we have other flows of consumptions and supply, such as the direct use of primary products. Crude oil can be sometimes used, for example, to generate electricity. And we have some byproducts and finished products that are transferred to be used as input to the refinery. Just a note on the byflows here, it represents the feedbacks from the petrochemical industries. We will not detail more here, but this is a part of the oil statistics that can be kind of complicated if we look in a more closer way. So now on the other end of the refinery, we have our refinery that will provide the gross inland deliveries of secondary oil products. But to sustain its activity, most of the time, the refinery burns some of its own production. So refinery fuels will be consumed within the refinery to sustain its own activity. Then we have the refinery gross output, so the outputs of, let's say, motor gasoline or diesel from the refinery, which will be part of the gross inland delivery, and the primary product receipts. So, for example, as I said before, the crude oil that will be used to be burned in a power plant to generate electricity. We can have then some products, so products transferred to be used as primary oil products in the previous slide, and inter-product transfers. Those transfers will be, for example, some specific refined oil products that will be used as another products with other properties. Then, of course, we can have some trades of those products, so import and export from outside of the countries, and international bunkers. So here we report all of the fuel consumptions for airplanes or maritime ways that concerns trips that originated or are going outside of the country, that are not staying from within the country. And again, we can have here also some stocks of those products for safety reasons, for commercial reasons, for many possible reasons. The gross inventories will be provided for energy sector use, for transformations, and for final and non-energy consumptions. Now, let's have a look at a complete oil data sets to indent some important trades for Sub-Saharan Africa. So, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in general, we can find countries that produce a lot of primary oil products, so crude oil, NGL, etc. So, the production that is there. But since the capacities, the activities of refinery is very low in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have very few importations of those primary oil, and a vast majority that is exported toward other countries that will who will do the activity of refined those primary products. So this high level of export that I told you shows the lack of capacities in refining. And then if we have a look at the oil products, we can see that the countries are mostly dependent on the importations of the secondary oil products to provide the demand of the population for mostly transportation here. As I told you, the refining capacity do not cover the regional demands. Hence, the reliance on imports that we can immediately see with our statistics. So, if we have a look on how we can try to check our data and make sure our data makes sense, one of the main things that we are paying attention to is the transformation efficiency. The transformation efficiency. When you take any transformations, here we'll be focusing on refinery, we check the outputs and the intakes of the refinery. Those are the two main elements that we have in terms of data. So we take these intakes and these outputs, and we try to see if the losses that occur during the transformations made sense or not, if the value of the losses that we see. Attention here, we speak about refinery losses when the intake is superior to the output, and refinery gains when the intake is inferior to the output. And we calculate the yield of this refinery by doing some simple calculation. We divide the outputs of total secondary products by the intakes of total primary products, and we put it in as a percentage. So we say that there are losses in the refinery if the yield is below 100%, and the gains if it's above 100%. Of course, here, if you do this calculation, you need to have everything at the same units, and units matters in this case. Because in mass units, you would expect some small losses and no gains at all. You do not create mass during such transformations. In energy units, it's the same. Due to evaporations, you would lose in total a little bit of the carbon content, so of the energy contained in those products. But in volumes units, if you calculate, for example, in liters or cubic meters, you would expect some slight gains because the products, the secondary oil products that you are creating in your refinery are lighter and occupy more volumes at the end of the refinery process. Now, if we discuss about the final consumption of those oil products, as I told you, those products have specific properties, specific physical and chemical properties, and for this reason, we expect them to have a specific use, a specific final consumption sectors in which we expect them to be. Of course, there can be exceptions in some countries, in some cases, but those in that case needs to be documented and explained in your statistics. So here are some examples. Crude oil, as you can be used in electricity plants, but you have also fuel oil and diesel that are most of the time used for this. In aviation, you would expect kerosene or aviation gasoline. Transportation, of course, we would expect gasoline, diesel, LPG, and etc. You can see here some main uses, maybe 1 point on non-energy uses. This part we still record it for accountability, and bitumen is mostly used, for example, in the creations of roads. This is the last part. This is the end for our discussion on oil products. Now let's talk about natural gas, and let's start with some key trends on these products. So, natural gas is the fossil fuels that grew the most in the last decades. Its largest producers are now USA and Russia. And its demand grew almost tripled since 1973, and it's mostly due to for its large demand in heat and power productions. Its trade is both in gaseous form through pipelines and in LNG forms, so liquefied forms through tankers, which explain partially its big increase in demand in the latest years because of its ease now to transport this commodity around the world. But it's not the only reason. The main reason is that natural gas is the fossil fuels that emit the less CO2 per unit burned. It's around 60% of coal, for example, which explains its interest for many countries to use this fossil fuel to reduce their carbon footprint while doing their green energy transitions. And as I told you, the dominance of pipeline trade has been decreasing since the emergence of liquefying technologies, which help bring this fossil fuel into other countries. Now, let's have a look at Africa situations. So, global demand for gas doubled since 1990, but in the case of Africa, it almost quadrupled in the same period. It still represents only 4% of the global demand, but still the growth is very impressive when we see it. This growth, as for any countries, is mostly grew by electricity demand. We see it right now. So this is the chart that presents the demand driving sectors for natural gas in various regions. So OECD, non-OECD, we can see that in any case, power and heat generations are on top of the driving sectors, but there are already a distinction between OECD and non-OECD regarding the demand in residential sectors, as many office and buildings in OECD are now hit by natural gas when it's less common in non-OECD countries. If we have a look at Africa and more specifically sub-Saharan Africa, we can see that this trend is becoming more and more visible, with Africa as the global consuming 60% of its natural gas for power and heat generation, and even more for sub-Saharan Africa. So our methodology to collect the data with the IEA in our methodology tries to cover all stages of its supply side. So firstly, we focus on the production of natural gas. Again, we talked about this in a few slides, but we focus on the domestic and marketable production here and received from other sources. This can be gases from an oil field or some gases coming from a coal mine, for example. Natural gas is mainly produced by extracting a mixture of methane from the underground deposits and also a small share of gas blended into the natural gas grid that come from oil, coal, or renewables. We also cover in our methodology the infrastructure that connect productions with consumptions. So this includes the transmission pipeline systems, the distribution systems, and some LNG, the LNG terminals in the country. Finally, at the end of the chain, natural gas is consumed in different sectors, such as the heat and electricity generation in power plants, or water and space heating for production in the residential and commercial sectors. Another very important part of the supply chain is the trade. Natural gas can be imported and exported through pipeline and liquefied, or liquefied. Now, the arrow that appear represent the interaction of the flow with the infrastructures. All the natural gas produced or imported by pipelines are mixed in the transmission systems, and the imports of LNG are regasified and then mixed. Some big power plants may be located right next to an LNG terminal and sourced directly from the regasification process. From the transmission system, it goes to the distribution network, which has a lower pressure. Most of the small and medium natural gas consumers are connected to this grid, which explains the importance for us to have a clear and precise data collections on the trade of natural gas to know which part has been imported as LNG or as gas through pipelines. Now, let's discuss again on the production of natural gas. As a reminder, in our methodology, we measure the productions once the products are in marketable states. This is once we have subtracted all the impurities and subtracted the quantities of natural gas flared or re-injected. Re-injected quantities often occur in an oil field with associated natural gas. They are re-injected to favorize more commercializable products and to keep the pressure within the field. Also, keeping track of re-injected quantities is not mandatory. We encourage countries to keep track of those values and especially of the flared gas, which are important for the CO2 accountability of a country. They represent a large part of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. So we have here an extraction point. It can be an oil field, a gas field, a coal mine, and from it we have the gross productions. This gross productions, part of it will be flared, as I told you, or re-injected. And then the rest goes through the natural gas processing, in which we extract the impurities of sulfur and other elements, and also natural gas liquid, NGL, that will be found later in our oil statistics, which refer to the previous part. And out of this processing, we will have the market productions of associated gas, non-associated gas, collier gas, and this is the reported quantity on which we focus later on in our statistics. Again, in any statistics work, the units and physical, and especially here the physical conditions in which the measure is made are important. Natural gas being a gas, the pressure and temperature at which you are doing the measure of volumes will impact the result of your measure, and it's important that those points are made in a clear in your datasets. As I told you before, regarding natural gas reporting, most of the difficulties comes actually from the trade data. Import should cover gas entering your countries for domestic consumption and reported under the country where the gas was produced. So import, for example, from Nigeria will be classified in such way. Export should be domestically produced, so before N, the unused quantity leaving the country should be reported under exports. To say it in another way, we focus on the ultimate origin or destinations of the gas, and we do not include in our data statistics the transit and re-export of natural gas. Now, if we talk a little bit about transformations, natural gas can be used in several ways to be transformed into another energy form. So the most obvious is the electricity and or heat plants, so to produce electricity and heat. But it can also be used in some coal processes, mixed with other elements in coke ovens, blast furnaces, or gasworks plants to generate several gases that will be burned to sustain the activities of those industrial activities. And finally, it can be used in a gas to liquid plants to generate some synthetic oil products. We will not go too much deep here, but keep in mind that this could be reported in some of the data you encountered. So now we are done with natural gas and we will move on toward coal statistics. Now we will talk briefly about coal and coal products. Regarding coals, the key trends are, of course, located in Asia with China and India. China is the world's largest producers of coal, followed closely by India, and those two countries use a large part of coal because of its abundance, cheap cost, and low technology barriers that allow a quick generation of electricity and support for industrial activities, such as iron and steel productions and cement manufacturers, for example. Coal has some environmental concern into its those activities because it is the largest CO2 emissions per unit of energy burned among conventional fuel. But it's not that of fuel from the past because it has some development possibilities such as carbon capture and storage, and could still have some years in the future of being consumed. Now, if we have a look at the classification in our methodology, there are several ways because of historical and scientific reasons of classifying coal. In our methodology, we try to do it by quality of the coal. So you would have here hard coal or brown coal, describing their physical aspect. And from that, we would have distinction between coking coal and tracite, over bituminous coal and subbituminous coal, and lignite. The distinction being made with their calorific value, the amount of energy that they contain, and the amount of carbon within their physical constituents. Another way to distinguish is to see through their usage. For example, coking coal is sometimes referred as metallurgical coal because it's used mostly in iron and steel industries, and anthracite and bituminous coal will be used mostly in electricity and heat generations or residential smaller activities, and will be referred as steam coal because of its use in generators. Lignite, it's still usually excluded from this kind of classifications. One important element here to keep in mind when you talk about the coal statistics are that calorific value may vary depending on the flows you are checking in your statistics. For example, the calorific value in your productions might not be the same as the one used in your consumption in electricity and heat generations because of selection of specific coal quality for specific consumption and the mix with the trade of those products. So if we check now those 5 types of coal that we discussed in the previous slide are what we call also primary coal. So fossil fuel extracted from a mine and made of carbonized vegetal matters under the form of a rock. But it is not the only the only product that we cover in coal. We have also derived fuel, such as we have secondary oil products, we can have some derived solid products from activities such as coal tar, coke coke, or patent fuels, and also some manufactured gases that are the outputs, some of the outputs of activities in metallurgical, in the metallurgical sectors, for example. As I told you before, the weighted average for calorific values are important to be made when you are working on coal because of the real variation you can encounter depending on the source of the coal you are checking right now. So here is a little example of a calculation in a country that use a mix of calorific value of coal coming from 3 other countries. And if we do the calculation of the weighted average, so as a reminder, you multiply the calorific value by the quantity, the respective quantity consumed, and you sum those elements and divide them by the total quantity consumed, you obtain the average net calorific value that you will be used for your total coal consumptions reported in your energy statistics. This can apply, of course, to any other energy commodity that you will be using in your datasets. One last part on calorific value. As I told you, we expect it to vary depending on the flows of consumptions. But of course, it is not the only way, we do not expect it to vary in a crazy, very large way. We expect for each product the calorific value to be within specific range of value. So for example, coking coal, we expect it between 25,000 and 33,000 kilojoules per kilograms. And also, depending on which products, we would expect the variation between the NCV and GCV to be around 5 or 10%. So this slide is available right now, so please don't hesitate to refer to it if you have doubts on the value you obtain for specific products that you would encounter. The coal balance, when we present it, is actually the easiest to represent in terms of difference between the supply and the demand. So supply, we have the domestic production from various sources, trade and stocks variations, and all those elements represent the supply of coal. And on the demand, you will have the transformations, we see that just after, the energy industry on use, and the total final consumptions. Don't forget that due to the way coal is transported, most of the time by trucks, there can be losses that are important. So don't forget to keep track of those distribution losses to keep your statistics in a good way. Coal balance. So we talk, as I told you, we talk now about and finally about transformations. It's actually the same almost setup as for natural gas. So you would have coal to consume in electricity and heat plants to generate those two energy commodities. And then you would have the consumption of coal within various industries such as coke ovens to create coke oven coke. Those products being used in blast furnace for metallurgical activities. And finally, you can have some coal used in gas works to generate gas workers and gas coke. One last part, at the end, this is in Africa only used in South Africa, but good to remember about it. You can use coke oven coke in liquefaction plants to generate some synthetic oil products. So not used in many countries, but still good to keep that in mind. If you see the term of synthetic crude oil, it can be coming from coal products. This is all that we will cover in coal for Africa. And now we turn to renewables statistics.
So I'm making a pause here to see if you have question and answers on oil, gas, and coal, and then we will continue. So I see that Nicolas has been answering a lot of questions in the question and answer box. Do not hesitate to drop questions if you have now, and Nicolas can reply to you.
Yes, in the meantime, we had several questions regarding LPG. So I will try to do an addendum here about LPG. So LPG it's the acronym for liquefied petroleum gases. So this usually when you are on the field, it's actually pretty rare to have just a natural gas field or an crude oil field. Most of the time, the both are mixed. And so, depending on the company and the type of reservoir, you would see exploitation of oil or gas or the both. And those products are mixed. It's not a pure gas in the pocket or a pure liquid. You have some bits of droplets of liquid within the natural gas and some bubbles of gases within the crude oil raw products at the end of the rig. So what most of the companies do is that they are separating the liquids and the gases, and a byproduct of this separation is the LPG, which is, I think the rate is around 40% from natural gases and 60% from crude oil. Sorry, there are noises. All right, should be better. So yeah, so as I told, LPG are the byproducts of the separations of the natural gas and crude oil, of the processing of those two products before they are at a marketable state. And indeed, this LPG is actually fuel that is used in several ways, especially in transportations or for domestic usage, such as cooking and heating in domestic parts.
Thanks, Nicolas.
And there have been also several several questions on the hard coal, brown coal, the distinctions. This is actually an old classifications, which date back actually from the 70s, I think, if I'm not wrong. So this is not exactly used anymore. We keep it because to maintain the historical data correct. So just keep in mind that brown coal are kind of natural rocks that are obviously brown, so brown rocks, and usually they had a lower calorific value than the other products that were hard coal. But do not dwell too much on this because it's almost not used anymore. People nowadays are either using the lignite, the bituminous coal classifications, or the metallurgical steam coal classification, which is more usage classification than description classification. So do not dwell too much on this specific distinction. It's not that used anymore. So an anonymous attendee asked us an example of oil products from coal. So in our coal statistics, we try to capture two things. First, they are the shale oil products, which are little bit in the between. They are captured in our coal annual questionnaire, for example, but they are mostly used after treatment as oil products. So those are specific, very specific situations that are not occurred in a lot of places. The second situation would be the coal liquefaction process, which is actually happening in South Africa, for example. So this process is done by a few companies in the world, mostly so in South Africa and in China. And this process is basically to liquefy some coal products so to ease the transport, to create what we call a synthetic oil. And this synthetic oil is easier to transport in those countries to reach far or to be used in the case of South Africa. But in case of China, for example, it's this way the energy products are easier to be transported in some secluded part of the country and to be consumed here for industrial activities. So those are two examples of oil products from coal. And one last question before we start again, Zakia, I think. So,
yeah.
Molato asked us, refinery losses occur due to evaporations. Can you elaborate more on refinery gains? Refinery gains, you should not see them normally because you cannot create mass or energy out of nowhere. So you should not see the occurrence of refinery gains, with the exceptions of if you are working in a volumes unit. For example, if you are creating some diesel from 1 cubic meters of crude oil, at the end you might end up with a bigger larger volume of products because of the process, and also the fact that you have make the products lighter and it gets a bigger volume. So this is the only situations where you would encounter refinery gains if you work in volume units. If you work in energy units or in mass units, you would not see, you should not see refinery gains. If you see some, it's either that you are missing a part of the input or of the feedstock reusing of some of the products. Yes, indeed, it's Sasol that products the synthetic oil. Diana. Thank you very much for completing my answer.
Yeah. Thanks, Nicolas. So we will move on with the second part. Before we go on with the presentation, let's do a few more Menti questions. So specifically on renewables and electricity. So if you connect again to Menti and use the same code as before, so 38, 12, 20, and 38. So the question is, what is the renewable energy source that witnessed the highest growth since 1990? So is it wind, solar PV, liquid biofuels, biogases, or geothermal? So which one of those renewable sources have witnessed the highest growth? Give you a few more seconds to answer. So we already have 20 participants that have replied, and most of you think that it is solar PV. And indeed, the correct answer is solar PV. Another question is, from an energy statistics perspective, what are the other uses of wood besides charcoal production? So can you use wood as a raw material for the production of furniture? Would you report that in your energy statistics? Or would you report a combustible for cooking and space heating? So from an energy statistics point of view, what uses of wood would you report besides charcoal production? So you have three choices: as a raw material for the production of furniture, as a combustible for cooking and space heating, or none of this. So most of you here, so again, we have 30 participants who have replied, and most of you think that you will report as a combustible for cooking and space heating. And indeed, this is the right answer. So, yeah. So now let's go back to the presentation and listen to the renewables and electricity part.
So now we will talk about renewables in our energy statistics. So when we talk about renewables, for example, here in the total energy supply, we can see that it represents global a little bit less than 40% of the total energy supply in the world. When we say renewables, this includes hydroelectricity and solar, wind, geothermal energy, and also biofuel and waste, which represent a large part of those renewables present within the total energy supply. If we look in more detail, we can see that almost 2/3 of renewables in our statistics are made of both biofuel and waste, and more specifically of solid biofuel and charcoal. Hydro represents the first element of electricity generations from renewable sources in our statistics. And it is present in a large part in the world electricity productions, which represent almost about 15% of the electricity generated in the world. Renewable sources are the energy communities that have the largest and most important growth rates in the world. Between 1990 and 2018, solar PV gained 36.5% of in productions, followed by wind, biogas, solar thermal, and liquid biofuels, which led to the total renewables to grow of 2%, which is more than the global total energy supply growth in the same period. Now we focus a little bit more on the biofuel part, which are, as we said before, important in Africa. So here is a reminder of the previous slide we showed before. So sub-Saharan Africa, around 75% of total energy consumption is made of biofuel and mostly traditional biomass. This has implications on health, on social life, and also on the environment of those countries because of deforestation and maintenance of the area for the populations. And if we have a look, we can see that this on those primary on those biofuels, a large part, 93%, is made of primary solid biofuel, and the lesser part, around 7%, of charcoal. Now it's time for us to dive a little bit deeper on how we classify renewables, because for now we have talked about a lot of different products. Renewables and waste can be classified into 4 different groups. The first one will be the renewable electricity, renewable energy, which have primary energy form of only electricity. This includes, of course, hydro, wind, tide, wave, and ocean electricity generation, and solar photovoltaic or solar PV. So in here, the first point of measurements for the statistics is the electricity produced from those plants and structures. The second part would be the renewable energy, which can produce both heat and electricity, which have a primary energy form of heat. This is composed of geothermal and solar thermal. And in that case, the first point of measurement would be the heat collected by the geothermal plant or the solar thermal panel. And then from this, we see the electricity generated. The third part would be the combustible fuels, which can be stocks or trade. So those are industrial waste, municipal waste, solid biofuel, biogases, and liquid biofuels. So they are treated such as the case of fossil fuel, let's say coal, for example, or oil products. So their quantities, their mass being used as a unit of measurement. And lastly, there is a non-combustible heat-only group which contains only heat pumps. This will not be covered too much deeply in here because it's not that present on the African continent. So now let's see about solid biofuels to dive a little bit deeper on those important elements in Africa. We focus, as a reminder, for solid biofuel only on the fuel produced for energy purpose. So it is a small part of the total, for example, wood that would be cut in a year. We also do the distinctions between primary and secondary fuel following what is recommended in the IEA. So primary production is the capture or extraction of the fuel of an energy form from natural energy flows from the biosphere, and those are only include the commercializable, marketable productions. The secondary production is a manufacture of energy production through the process of transformations of other fuel or energy, whether primary or secondary. So now that this distinction is made, let's see example of solid biofuel we can encounter. So you would have bagasse, which are a byproduct of the sugar industry, and same for other agronomic industry. You could have rice husk, olive cake, industrial wastes in a renewable form, for example, the natural rubbers. You have then wood pellets and animal waste, black liquor that are byproducts of paper industries, and of course, wood and woody materials, firewood, wood chips, sawdust, etc. And finally, one element in which we will dive a little bit deeper, charcoal, which is a product produced from wood products at the origin. So if we follow the biofuel transformation for charcoal productions, unlike the other transformation of combustible fuels, the transformation of wood to charcoal is covered by many international organizations to really dive and try to know more about it. The production of charcoal is an output of a transformation process where wood is considered the input. The losses from this are included in the transformation sector and are checked by calculating the efficiency of the process. Hence, the importance to have some net calorific value for wood and for the charcoal produced so that we can have a clear view on the efficiency of these transformations. So, as before, we can see that wood is an input into the charcoal kiln. So here you have two examples of kiln that can be found in the world. And the output is the charcoal. So important facts about the charcoal production. The efficiency, of course, is the input divided by the output divided by the input. In energy units, we focus here on the energy content. So the reference NCV of charcoal that we use in our statistics is 30,800 kilojoule per kilograms. And the charcoal kiln efficiency that we usually expect is between 10 to 40%. Actually, in reality, we see efficiencies in our data set that goes from 20 to 70%. And this is an ongoing work to try to improve the data collection on those transformations so that we can have more sensible data in the end. Now we will see about the electricity statistics. So first of all, let's see some electricity trends. And what can be said about electricity demand and, of course, then production has grown a lot in the last 20 years, mostly due to the increased level of incomes from various regions such as Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So the global production in 2018 was more than 26,000 terawatt hours, which is equivalent of 4.5 million wind turbines in the world. And Sub-Saharan Africa witnessed a threefold increase faster than the rest of the African continent. So we can see that electricity can be generated from various other sources, such as solar, hydro, nuclear, or fossil fuel, gas, oil, and coal. If we look at the share of each of those sources for electricity generation, we can see that depending on the region you are looking at, the origin of electricity will be really different. For example, in the case of OECD, it's more or less spread between coal, gas, and nuclear. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we see that hydro represents a large majority of the generations, followed closely by gas. Electricity generation mix is highly dependent on the most available and cheapest sources, as well as political choices and incentives in a determined country or regions. So if we look, for example, at the difference between the share of solar generations in OECD or in Sub-Saharan Africa, we can see here difference in terms of access to the technology and political decisions made in various countries. Now, here are examples of both electricity mix in different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And obviously, it's really dependent on the political choices of one country and the availability within the border of the country. So now let's have a closer look at the electricity consumption by sectors to see where it is mostly consumed. In non-OECD countries in general, it's mostly consumed in industries. This is mostly due to the preeminence of China and India data within those countries. But in in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, we see that this share is mostly, first place is mostly occupied by residential and in a lesser way by industries in terms of consumptions. So now let's have a look at residential electricity demand, since it was that important in the previous slide. So the increase in wealth drives higher consumption per capita, and then allows more people to have access to electricity in those countries. And this is a feedback loop. The more access led to an increase in wealth, etc., etc. So we can see in several countries between 2010 and 2019. For example, here you can see Ethiopia, but with the access growing for the population, we have an increase of the GDP within the country. So both elements are connected in our datasets. Now let's talk a little bit more about the data landscape. So how do we represent a tricky issue that are electricity and heat datasets? In terms of supply, we collect the fuel inputs to electricity and heat generations, so the quantity of coal or natural gas burnt to generate electricity. From this, we obtain the gross productions, and we subtract to that the own use by the electricity plant to obtain the net production. In addition to those various elements, one can extract from the production the pumped storage hydro. In some specific hydro plants, the water are pumped back to play the role of stocks of possible energy sources, and some more detailed elements that are not that present on the African continent, which are electric boilers and heat pumps. Then we have the trade, so import and export of electricity. They are specific in the case of specific rules in case of electricity. We will see them a little bit later. And also an important part, which are the losses in transmission and distributions of this electricity. This precise element can be high in case of old or badly maintained transmission and distribution systems, but also due to theft of electricity. At the end of the chain, for the demand, we would have the final consumption of electricity for residential, industries, etc. In addition to all those elements that will be in either physical units for the fuel inputs or in gigawatt hours, one can collect also the peak load and the capacity of this electric system, which are very good indicators to be used later on the development of the country. So firstly, let's look at sources of electricity to see how we distinguish the possible sources. Electricity is produced as both primary and secondary energy commodity. Primary electricity is obtained from natural sources such as hydro, solar photovoltaic, wind, tidal, or wave energy, for example. Secondary sources are obtained from the heat generated by burning a combustible fuel. So either fossil fuel, coal or gas, etc., or also from nuclear fissions, from geothermal energy, and from solar thermal heat. So this is the first distinction that you can find in the dataset when we talk about primary electricity and secondary electricity. Now, also some distinctions we can do in the electricity data are the type of producers. You can have main activity producers, which for whom the generations and of electricity or heat and the sale of this production to third party is their primary activity. So most of the time, those are plants like nuclear plants thermal plants, natural gas electricity plants, but for which the sole objective is to sell this electric or heat generated. And then we have the auto producers. Auto producers generate electricity and heat as a second or byproduct of their own activities. Let's say, for example, windmill that will generate a little bit of electricity from its activity. It can so sell this electricity to the grid without this being its main source of incomes. Now, another distinctions in a type of plant will be the type of energy that is produced at the end. So you have electricity only, heat only, or combined heat and electricity, which is also referred as CHP, combined heat and power. Now that we have seen the distinctions we can do in the data, let's talk again about efficiency. So if we insist on this in this conference, because efficiencies are important to keep good track of your data sets and check the quality of your data set. And again, the efficiency is calculated by the output divided by the input in net using net calorific value for the to work on energy units. And in energy units, it's always below 100%. The efficiency will differ by fuel or technologies. And once again, you must calculate your efficiency in energy unit every time you can. So, for example, an input of 100 units into a power plant would have an output of 20 units plus 45 units of 20 units of electricity plus 45 units of heat. And if you calculate the efficiency, considering it's all in the same unit, you have a 65% efficiency. The rest, the 45 units lost, are what we call the heat loss, and are part of any transformations from one form of energy to another. So, just a reminder, use the same energy units everywhere. And the importance in energy balance, as you've seen in other presentations, of picking the correct energy unit. Now, let's go back a little bit when we were discussing about capacity. In addition to production, consumption, and trade data, we try also to capture in our data the power plant capacity, specifically the net maximum capacity. Net maximum capacity is simply the maximum power output that a power plant can produce with all plants running at full blast, and we consider from methodological vision that we capture this on the 31st December of the reporting year. These are useful data for analysts to have. However, they can also be useful for statisticians when checking the data, as we can compare actual reported production value with the maximum potential production values to check if the data makes sense. This value, actual production divided by potential production, is called the capacity factors. So, as you can see, capacity factor is actual production divided by capacity times the time of a year. In that case, or in any other time frame you are working here. Again, this value should always be less than 100%, except if there were plants closure near the end of the year, in which case the figure may be distorted. And there are different expected values depending on the technology. For instance, nuclear plants are expensive to build and therefore are typically run as much as possible, whereas solar PV, which does not run at night and is both weather and location dependent, will have a lower capacity factors. So, as statisticians, we can use both historical and expected capacity factor as a check in our data. Now, let's talk again on the concept between gross and net productions. Gross production refers to the total output of electricity or heat generated in the facility before any use. However, not all of this is used for productive purpose beyond the power plants. Some of the electricity and heat generated is used on-site at the power plant for lighting, heating, and to support plant operations. This is referred to as on-use. The remainder that is left after subtracting the on-use is the net production. However, remember that for auto producers, productions only refer to the heat sold, heat or electricity sold to the grid, which bring to this kind of which brings us to a final check that you can do regarding the on-use, that we expect it should not vary too much over time and stay around 5%. So as I told you in the previous slide, you have also a value expected, which is the transmission and distribution losses. So let's see a little bit more what's happening in the various part of those losses. As electricity travels through cables and transformers, energy is lost along the way. Much of this is in the form of heat, as the electric current flowing through the cable raises its temperature. This energy is lost as it dissipates into the surroundings, reducing the amount of energy that reaches the final destinations. In general, losses can be expected to be in the range about 5 to 15%. With losses on the lower end of the scale observed in more advanced, compact, and well-maintained grid, and higher losses observed in older or more distributed grid, and where there is a high rate of meter bypassing, in other words, theft of electricity. Now, let's see to finish on trade for electricity. As I told you, there are specific rules regarding trade of electricity. Unlike other fuels, trade of electricity and heat are more difficult to understand because they are not physical units that you can move by yourself. It's a flow of electrons through a cable. So how do you report this? Well, you report it as a flow, actually, like a flow going through borders of a country. And in that case, we do not focus on the origin and destinations of those electrons. Let's take an example to see it a little bit more clearly. Here we have 3 countries, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. So let's imagine that Togo is importing electricity from Nigeria through the network of Benin. Those 3 countries would have to report the flows as it follows. Nigeria would report exportations toward Benin. Benin would report some importation from Nigeria and the same value exported towards Togo. And Togo would report the importation from Benin. So here, for electricity, this is the only part where in our methodology we report the transit of flows. Now we will briefly discuss on the possible electricity data sources for the data collections. So very briefly, we already discussed about it before. You can use surveys toward power productions, toward enterprise, household, or market or operators to collect from them on a regular basis data on value of production or consumptions. You can use administrative data from energy regulators, customs office for the trade, and data collecting from program policy implementations to check the efficiency of specific policies. You can use direct measurements, so using conventional or smart meters to directly measure on a building or on a specific place the consumption on regular points. And finally, you can use estimation and modeling, for example, using the plant capacity information to estimate generations of a specific source. With this, we reach the end of these presentations. So the IEA have a lot of resources available online. So some free products such as keyword energy statistics, data and statistic browser, and energy atlas manuals on energy statistics methodologies. And we have also a lot of various energy data on specific flows, on CO2 emissions, and or energy price.
So now, if you have any questions for Nicolas, again, do not hesitate. I see you have been dropping quite a few in the Q&A box, and Nicolas has been replying during the presentation.
Yes, there was one question in the meantime for you to write down that I wanted to discuss. It was regarding the charcoal. Let me, so there are 2 points in charcoal. The first one was the point of measurement for the efficiency is only the kiln, the oven to produce the charcoal in our methodology, and or as well the efficiency of the conversion technologies for the end users. The thing is, in a policy, in a work on energy efficiencies, to have the efficiencies of the end users transformation to cook or to heat will be indeed interesting. But in the real world, we have a lot of difficulties to already collect data on the charcoal generations, its creation itself. So to have the data on the end users is a little bit far-fetched. If you have data or information on this, please be sure to share it also with the other participants of this training and with us, because this will be something that is of real interest for many of the people who work on energy statistics, especially in Africa, because of that the consumption of food and charcoal is a great part in our statistics right now. And where was I lost the questions? There was another question regarding charcoal. I wanted to reply.
I think you replied one on for charcoal, the point of measurement, is it only the kiln efficiency or what was the efficiency?
Strange, there was another one I saw.
There's another one?
Right.
No. I don't see any other.
Right, surprising. Anyway, it will come back. One other question from Martin that was interesting was regarding the efficiencies range for thermal power plants. So this varies mostly with the fuel used and the technologies. If you are looking at an old coal power plant that dates back from the 70s, most probably you would have a 20% efficiency and even below if there are some technical issues occurring during the combustion, some leaks of hot air, etc. If you look at the latest combined cycle natural gas power plant, they can reach sometimes efficiencies of 40% and above. So those are really interesting technologies for many countries, especially in case of combined cycle for North African countries who are producing a lot of natural gas. So being able to burn it domestically, it's very interesting for them. So it's really a question of which fuel, which technologies, and if you want to improve the efficiency of a plant, most of the time it goes with a lot of maintenance, checking that everything is working as it should to keep the efficiency as at the nominal ID. And then if you want to go with the better efficiency, most of the time it goes with changing the technology used or the fuel burnt. So now we have 3 questions. So when calculating statistical differences, we learned that it should never be too high nor zero. I would like to know how high it's too high. What is recommended range for your statistical? Of course, it's always a question also of the theory, where you should have small statistical differences around 1–2% just because of issues in the measurement of the various data in the supply or domestic side. In the real life, you can end with higher statistical differences because of also other problems within the data, missing element or estimation that goes on for too long. Most of the time in our part, we try to keep the statistical differences below 5%, preferably. If it's below 10%, we will say, depending on the fuel and the type, it will be kind of acceptable depending on the data quality that we have at first, but 5% is the limit that we try to keep in our mind to have it done. So how do we report green hydrogen production and use? Hydrogen, it's something that we do not cover yet. And honestly, I haven't worked with that. So for now, it's not covered, or if it is, it's mixed with natural gas data. So it's not the best approach, but this is what we do for now, since it's not that developed as a product right now.
Yeah, but from what is being done in the World Energy Outlook, they treat hydrogen a bit like biofuels. So what you would do for biodiesel.
Yeah, there are discussions currently between the international organizations to harmonize the methodologies and how to collect those data, because right now, yeah, it's not that.
Yeah, it's not yet set in stone, the proper methodology. To stay in time, maybe Nicola, you can reply to the questions in the chat box, and I will move on with the exercise so that we try to finish at on time.
All right.
There's two last questions. Yeah.
All right, so I answer both of them and we can move quickly. So actually there is a question on charcoal I was looking for. So yes, the factors of efficiency of the kiln, well, it's again a question of technology, because in some countries there are industrial kiln to produce charcoal. I know, for example, in Uganda and Egypt, we have documentation saying that we can reach around 32% of efficiencies in the transformation of wood into charcoal. So those are pretty high efficiencies. But in other parts, we can see some old traditional kiln where basically the wood is buried underground and burned underground. In those, actually, we do not have direct measurement, real measurement of the thing. So we know it's low efficiency, but we do not know exactly at what efficiency we are right now. So actually, I know that IRENA has started a campaign of direct measurements of various elements to actually find and work with consultants to actually get precise information and develop a tool to estimate those efficiencies depending on which technologies, methods you are using right now on this. And the last question before we move out, so to the exercise, so how do we account for internal electricity losses apart from the one at export level? How do we account for internal electricity losses apart from the one at export levels?
So
I mean, you see the differences between the gross output of the plant and the part of electricity that is sold to the grid, I think. While the rest, the differences between what is generated by the plant and what is exported outside of the outside in the grid, we generally classify this into the own use part of the plant. So this is what we input in the own use electricity consumptions. And the rest of the losses, so the losses that occur in the transmissions or distribution part of the network, those are what we put actually in the losses line of our methodology. And we have someone that is asking to receive the exercise and
yeah, so this one I will after the training I will send to you the material.
Right.
So thanks a lot, Nicola. Yeah. So and now let's look at the exercises, at the exercise that we had. Can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes, we can. Yeah, we can see it. Yes.
Oops, sorry. Yeah. So the first exercise, it was on natural gas. So you have a table you have a statistics table on natural gas with production up to supply and also the demand data. So here you're asked to study the efficiency of the electricity generation of country A from natural gas. So the first question was using the gross calorific values here for natural gas production and imports, so those two, calculate the weighted average gross calorific value, sorry, for production and imports for 2013 up to 2019. So you have the data in million cubic meters. You also have the gross calorific value in megajoules per cubic meter, and you want to calculate the weighted average calorific value. So for the weighted average calorific value, you multiply each production. So here it's the production number by the gross calorific value of production plus the imports value times the gross calorific value, and you divide it by the total amount here. So this is the formula. It's a sum product of those divided by the sum of those. So here you see that the gross the weighted average calorific value, it's 41.3, and if you drag the formula up to 2019, you get 39. So here if you look a bit at the numbers, you see that the weighted average calorific value in 2013, it's very close to the one of imports. And that is because if you look at the quantities, production is very low, only 9 million cubic meters, whereas the rest of the supply, it's coming from imports. But if you look at 2019, you see that the calorific value is more weighted because you have an increased production, which is very close to that of imports. So it's really like a weighted average. So this is the explanation, which I just explained orally. The second question is, can you identify something wrong with the production gross calorific value? So here, do you see anything strange? So it all looks the same. It's exactly the same value and it's fixed throughout the years. So this is suspicious. And for this, there are many reasons why it's fixed. It could be that it's the data source is using the same value when reporting. Also, how can we correct this? So we can first discuss with the producer company to know if they can provide more information on this. You can we can try to develop a survey, a questionnaire, or even use a mandate to make the producing company publish this information, because very often they are not publishing that, they just report the production amounts. Sorry, I have an internet problem. Okay. So yeah, there are several ways where you can try to investigate why this value is fixed. Normally, the average natural gas calorific value, it's expected to be within a 37.5 and 40.5 megajoule per cubic meter. So this value, it's within the range still. So now we are done with question 1, and the question 2 is, if we use the gross calorific value of natural gas here, calculate the natural gas balance in terajoule gross calorific value. So here you have numbers in million cubic meters, you have your calorific values, and here we want to fill the yellow cells. So for production here, you will just take your amount in million cubic meters and you multiply by your production, right? And you do the same for imports, you do the same for exports. So, and for production and imports, you know exactly the calorific values. But for example, for exports, you will use the weighted average calorific value, given that you don't have the proper information. And same for stock changes, where you will apply the weighted average calorific value, and then it's the same formula for the rest of the years. And same for electricity plants, industry, residential, other, you would use the weighted average calorific value. With this, you are able to just compute your demand, which is the sum here. So that's already calculated. The third question is, using the calculated balance, so the one that we just filled here in yellow, can you calculate a verification indicator for statistical difference? So what indicator can you create to check your statistical difference? And very often we calculate the statistical difference over the supply. So we calculate this share to see if it's coherent. So as we said, ideally, we would like statistical difference to be close to 0, but we know very well that in most cases, it's not the case. And here, when you calculate it, so you take the statistical difference and you divide it by your supply, you get -2% for 2010. And if you drag the formula up to 2019, you get -4 for 2019. So now if we look at all this, if we observe this indicator, do you see any year for which the statistical difference suggests there is a problem with the data? So yes, we see that in 2015, the statistical difference is extremely low. It's -55%. And this is not normal and needs to be queried. And every time a statistical difference is above 5%, you need to start digging a bit to see what's happening there and to see if there is a problem in the underlying data. Because it's a sign that either a flow in the supply or in the demand might be misreported. So here indeed we see that the electricity plant number in 2015, it's quite high here, leading to this big statistical difference. So your demand and your supply is quite different. Now, if we look at, we are given more information now on electricity. Above it was on natural gas. Now it's on electricity. So you have your electricity output in gigawatt hour for different products, and you have your total generation, your total demand, and the statistical difference. And the first question is, using the natural gas and the electricity generation data, as well as conversion factors provided. So here we give some factors to convert from gigawatt hour to kilowatt hour, as well as gigawatt to terajoule. So here we are asking to calculate the electricity generation efficiency for natural gas. Here, so we want to fill this cell. So here efficiency, we know it's output divided by input, but it has to be in the same energy unit. So here we want to convert the gas numbers into gigawatt hour. So here what we do is that we take the natural gas output, we divide it by the natural gas input here, which is in terajoule, but we want to convert this terajoule number into gigawatt hour. So we divide it by 3.6, which is the conversion factor from gigawatt to terajoule. So output divided by input in gigawatt hour gives you an efficiency of 30%. And if you drag the formula up to here for 2019, so natural gas output divided by natural gas input here converted into gigawatt hour, which will give you 35%. So again here, do you notice an issue with any of the calculated efficiencies? Indeed, the efficiency in 2015, it's quite low. It's only 20%, which is suspicious. And what could be the issue here? As we have seen before, what is suspicious here, it's the statistical differences, and the suspicious number would be the electricity inputs here. Because the output here, if you look at the natural gas electricity output in 2015, it looks reasonable compared to the time series. There is no big jump or decline, but your input is very high here. So this is suspicious, and this is what is leading to this efficiency. So this we answered. How do we correct this then? How do we make a correction to have a proper efficiency? So here, what we would suggest is that you know that the efficiency for the year before and the year after, it's 35%. So it looks reasonable to apply a 35% efficiency here. So because I had already copied. So if we apply a 35% efficiency to your input here, so what I'm doing is that I'm back calculating my electricity plants in here using a 35% efficiency. So I know my output is correct and I know the efficiency. So I back calculate my input here, and miraculously my statistical difference get fixed. It's no more minus 55, but it's only minus 2% now. And my efficiency, as we said, it's 35%. So that was the exercise for today. I recommend that you take your, if you have not done the exercise before, if you can redo it, given all the indication I gave today, and try to understand again the different concepts behind the questions and the tables, that would be great. If you have any questions, we have 1 minute left before the end of the session. You can drop it here, or you can send me an email, and I will happily reply to you. no questions. Trying to see if we have questions. No questions on the exercise, everyone. I hope I have been clear enough. Again, if you have any question on the exercise, let me know. You can drop it down in the Q&A box here. You can write to me separately. I'm happy to correct it for you as well. You can try to do it by yourself and send it to me, and I can correct it without any problem. Well, I think I don't see any questions. So this is the end of the session today. And thank you very much for your attention during the past 2 hours. Tomorrow we will work on energy balances and CO2 emissions. So see you tomorrow at 9. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day. Bye.